Welcome to From Concept to Concert with the Hamilton Philharmonic Orchestra. My name is Abigail Richardson-Schulte, and I'm composer in residence with the HPO. I am joined by Alexander Cann, who is artistic director of the Bach Elgar Choir. Welcome, Alexander. We are really excited about our upcoming production of Handel's Messiah on December 16th and December 18th. This should be great. Now, for those people watching who may not have seen Messiah before, can you give us an idea of what to expect? What is it about and what makes it so great?
Well, it is great. It's a terrific piece. It's a piece of really awe-inspiring beauty and power. And it's not for nothing that it is a perennial favorite of concert audiences. It's extremely moving, from dark pathos to ebullient joy. It spans the human experience. It spans human feeling, and it does so by telling the story of one extraordinary life, of course, the life of Jesus, but done at a distance so that we can directly empathize and understand in terms of our own experiences and our own lives. And of course, it contains so many gems, including some of the most famous pieces in classical music or in music at all, like the Hallelujah, of course, a truly, thunderous and thrilling moment. So it is a thing. It is a thing for a good reason. It's a marvelous thing.
Mhm. And what can we expect in terms of forces? What will we see on stage?
Well, we have a big concert choir, so over 50 singers, and we have a Baroque orchestra. It's the Hamilton Philharmonic, so it's a modern orchestra assembled to play this work of 25 players. So it's very complementary forces in a somewhat intimate and really very beautiful venue, which is Central Presbyterian Church in Hamilton. Really one of the most astonishingly beautiful interior spaces in the city. And so what you get is a very powerful but also intimate concert experience with us.
Great. Now, what is special about this production?
Well, I say the two things that are really most special about this are the really tremendously wonderful orchestras we've got in town here, the Hamilton Philharmonic, which it really is just superb under the baton of Gemma New, who's really just continuing taking this orchestra to new heights. And I say that as a frequent concert goer and admirer. And then you've got my chorus, and I like to think our chorus is pretty good. And the thing about a chorus that makes it really quite good for this is that we're a Messiah chorus. So we've done this, every year for a long time, at least 15 years. I'm not sure beyond that, but a long time, to the point that it's the music's in our bones, and we're the right size for the show too. It's just the right size in my feeling for Messiah. It's 50 voices are capable of delivering some power. And so that combination of our deep knowledge of the work and the Hamilton Philharmonic's excellence, really will be very special.
Mhm. And we should also mention that we have some spectacular soloists lined up for this. That the Messiah is a mix of orchestra and solo numbers and choir. So those great soloists make a big difference as well. We're really looking forward to having them.
Yeah, we sure do. I mean, this name of Meredith Hall, Jenny Enns Modolo, Benjamin Butterfield, and Giles Tompkins. It's just a terrific lineup.
Great. Now, the Messiah is an oratorio. Can you tell us what is the difference between an oratorio and an opera?
Well, no, I can't really. I mean, the only real difference is that an oratorio is performed without staging, right? You just stand and deliver. But of course, a lot of operas are done that way sometimes. Sometimes operas are performed that way where resources don't exist, or where an artistic company decides to do it that way because it has merit, where you can just get on stage and just simply perform the music. So that's really the only significant difference between opera and oratorio in general. But Messiah is a special one, and it's unique even for oratoria, if that's a plural.
Mhm.
In that it is, it's not for, it really is maybe the best loved oratorio of all time. And it is distinct, it is somewhat different in that it doesn't have uh, a character, it doesn't have named characters, it doesn't have a really conceivable plot line other than the general outline of the life of Jesus and of the impact of Jesus. So it works, in other words, uniquely well as a concert performance. I think that's one of the reasons.
Right, right. And there's no staging, as you say. And there's also no direct interaction between characters, like that dramatic element isn't there with this. And of course, it is also it is based on the Bible. That's another thing with oratorios, is of course they have that background. And I find the whole buildup of oratorio and English oratorio to be kind of fascinating.
Mhm.
So Handel had some experience writing oratorios when he was in Rome, and there was a brief ban on opera, and so he wrote oratorios. Of course, they weren't staged. And then a lot of the time, oratorios were allowed to be presented during Lent, when opera was not allowed. So again, the sort of the spiritual background, which was allowed to be presented during Lent. But Handel could have had a sort of a cushy life in Germany. He was a German composer, of course, with a court. He, in fact, did have a court position that he left to go and live in London for. He could have been a church organist. He was trained in that. But instead, he became an opera impresario in London, which I find just fascinating at the time for
They
him to make
laughed at
that
him.
choice. They loved it.
Yeah.
And, he was composing operas. He was often traveling to Italy to recruit the latest, best opera singers and bring them to London.
Mm.
But in 1728, we had the production of John Gay's A Beggar's Opera, which really was a satire, and it made fun of Italian opera. And that was a big changing point. So then audiences started to wonder if, opera was this grand thing after all, and if the aristocracy should be supporting such a thing. Then a couple of years later, a rival opera company was started, the Opera of the Nobility. And, at that point, then we had 4 years of opera war in London, and they were taking Handel's singers and presenting them as their own, and it was just really difficult. And Handel had to, of course, raise money, and while all of this was going on in the public eye, which was difficult. And English oratorio came out of that because he was offering an alternative, and he offered something that they could understand
Well, that's
in
the key.
English. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I find that really interesting.
Well, the Canadians, I think, to a large degree, share the national characteristic with the Brits of really not having a lot of time for high pretension. And so I think a lot of what was going on there was a reaction against the pretensions of what was Italian, an Italian form that performed in Italian, that right over the heads of they might pretend that they knew Italian, but very few of them did, really did in terms of the audience, although more than they would today. And that high pretension, I think it just didn't really mesh with the national character. And so that the return, when finally there was an alternative that was offered in the vernacular in English, good old ordinary English, and with of course with Messiah, it's the the Book of Common Prayer and the King James Bible. Well, they could understand this as their own.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So Handel, of course, he developed the pattern of writing these in the summer, and then his operas would then be premiered in the following opera season. In this case, he decided to have the premiere of the Messiah in Dublin rather than in London. And it's kind of an interesting story there, in that he had an inkling that people might object to the Bible ending up in prophet. right? And so he deliberately set up the premiere to have the profits going to charity, and divided the proceeds between the three different charitable organizations, and got, I think, something like 140 something people out of jail because they were freed due to their debts. So that's kind of a funny thing. The premiere of the Messiah got people out of jail.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's marvelous. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so that was really the premiere of it. It did very, very well. He expected it to be a big success. And because they wanted to cram as many people as they could into the theater, which could hold 700 people, they asked gentlemen not to bring their swords and ladies not to wear hoops in their dresses. So it came in with a splash. Everybody loved it. And then before he left, he did present it again in Dublin for profit. But then when he presented it in London, he did have a bit of backlash about that. And I have a quote about this. One of the local newspapers wrote, "Is an oratorio an act of religion? If it is, I ask if the playhouse is a fit temple to perform it in. On the other hand, if it is for diversion and amusement only, what a profanation of God's name and word it is to make so light use of them." So even Handel and the Messiah, had problems in his day. You wouldn't think so, but I guess here's a question for you, and especially you're a church musician as well, right? How does the Messiah fare in modern day? With the decrease in church attendance and knowledge of the Bible. I mean, in its day, it was, as you say, so accessible for people that it was in English and that it was a Bible stories that they knew.
Well, it still remains very popular, and I think it, in many respects, it's hard to say about what's happening in Christian culture generally because some churches are in decline and others are growing. So I'm not really too sure if I can really generalize about that. But certainly, this is a product of a high church culture. This came out of very sophisticated thinking and writing. Jennings, who put the libretto together, it's not just a casual pastiche. The libretto of Messiah, in other words, the words of it, lyrics, are very carefully put together, right? I mean, which showed a remarkable erudition, actually. And it came from a high church inculcation. And so that culture may not exist today quite in the same degree of fabulousness that it might have 50 years ago in this country, but the cultural products of it, like Messiah, the people are still, if not more, curious and more willing to engage with that.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about what happened to the Messiah after Handel's death. And, in the decades and centuries afterwards, it expanded. A number of people, composers wrote their own versions. Mozart wrote a version of it, including clarinets and trombones, reflecting the orchestra of his day. But he was very clear to say this is not better. This is just a different version of it. But we also have examples of choirs with 800 people and massive orchestras. I mean, I can't even imagine the venue that would support such a production. But I mean, I wonder if, as a choir director, if you have to be concerned with performance practice, because certainly in the last 50 years, the music scene has been more interested and engaged with trying to recreate the music as it originally was intended. So, is that an issue for you as a choral director? And do you have to decide on the right size of choir, the best size of choir for this work?
Well, I've been involved with a number of performances of this piece and with a number of different groups, and I have to say that I think the size that suits it, the kind of choir that suits it best in terms of presenting it in a contemporary Canadian context would be about what we got, which would be about 50, 60, 70 singers, because then you have the power, and you have the people. It's the people who are singing it. We are an amateur choir, which in whose ranks you find professional singers. We have some professional singers who sing within the group, but we're largely a good amateur choir, and for me that without that. This work in particular is missing its core spirit. That's extremely important, and I think that's extremely important to the audience as well, because contemporary versions that are really very closely, very carefully aligned with best practices, best understood ideas about historically informed performance, meaning Baroque, real Baroque style, tend to use all professional singers. Really, because the groups tend to be much smaller due to economy, and also because asking very specific stylistic ideas out of singers in very very virtuosic music. It requires professionals. So that's the TOEFL music show for you. If you want to see that, that's the TOEFL music show. For me, I prefer something that's got a little bit more meat to it. Because of the universal themes here, and also because of just the psychology of choral music generally. For me, I find it much more satisfying, and find that it connects with audiences much better.
Mhm. Can you talk to us about your preparation with the choir? I mean, I know you have a concert just I think a few weeks away from the Messiah. How does that work? Although you mentioned that your group has performed this many times
Well,
before.
you got it. Yeah, you got it. That's how it works. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, Messiah is, although you might think it's quite ordinary in the sense that it's performed so often. It's also extremely difficult. I mean, it's really, and not so much for the orchestra. To be fair, it's not actually difficult for the orchestra, but it is extremely insanely difficult for the chorus, to a degree where if it wasn't done every year, you would have to really plan and give it a whole chunk of rehearsal time in order to get it anywhere near. So that's how we do it, and we don't want to let go of that ball, because if we were to turn into a once every 5 year Messiah group, we would lose that institutional memory of it. So that's, yeah. And anyway, there's an ongoing demand, and it's lovely for the choristers to open the books and be delivering high level music right away from the drop of the baton. That's a great joy for choristers who otherwise learn at a slower rate than a professional orchestra might.
Right, right. And I guess you have to be absolutely ready because we put you into quite a tight rehearsal schedule to actually get this going, in a professional orchestra schedule then.
Yeah.
So,
Well, we have our own schedule outside, so we've
yeah,
already been looking at it,
right.
right? So, but when it comes down to the final crunch, of course, one of the great joys for us is that we get about double the contact time with orchestra than we would do under our own dime.
Oh,
Right. So yet another opportunity for us to really take this to new heights. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, my last question for you is about the famous choral number, the most famous choral number in this, the Hallelujah chorus. And there's a tradition of standing up. Do you think that'll happen? And do you know why that is?
Well, I have no doubt that it will happen because it's happened at every one I've ever done.
Okay.
I once attended a performance in Quebec, and I started standing up, and the person next to me, who was Quebecoise, she said, "No, no, we don't do that here. We don't."
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
yeah. So I didn't realize. And indeed, no one stood. But I don't know if that's still the case. That was some time ago. But yeah, it's an interesting little historical quirk, a little tradition that I think has been going on since the 18th century. I'm not sure right from the beginning, and I'm not sure. There's a somewhat uncertain story about the sovereign King George II standing, but this is really cast in some considerable doubt.
And
Um,
people think that he may not have even seen the Messiah, or
right.
there's no evidence to say that he did. So where
Yeah.
does that come from?
Well, of course, there's all sorts of issues to do with etiquette in British society generally. So it wouldn't have to have been the sovereign. It could have been somebody else who, I mean, there are issues like this all the time. I remember my father complaining to me that where he was present at a dinner with the Prince of Wales, and the Prince of Wales finished his dinner and left. He was like 14 years old, and that meant that everybody else had to leave too.
Right.
So he didn't get his dinner.
Oh, that's
So
funny.
this kind of thing is normal in that society, and in those days, I'm sure there could have been any number of reasons. But we take it today as a sign of respect, really, to just a tremendous cultural cultural. Tradition is too weak a word, but it's a pillar. Really, it's a pillar of our culture.
Yeah, I love it when it happens. It's a special moment. Now, I said that was going to be the last question, but I have a sort of a spin-off here because it relates to tradition. You know, typically audiences that are used to going to classical concerts don't clap between movements. But what happens in the Messiah? Do they clap? Do they not?
Never in my experience. No, I think it's because of the way that it's structured that the pieces, the individual movements are short. So they're I don't think, whereas say in a concerto where a 12-minute say first movement, there's and with a great sense of apotheosis, maybe there's a reason why an audience might feel the urge to punctuate it, but I've never experienced that. And I've experienced that at the end of the Hallelujah chorus. But I mean,
It's pretty
fair
grand.
enough. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Well, thank you so much for speaking with me, and please join us on December 16th or 18th for performance of Handel's Messiah with the HPO and the Bach Elgar Choir and soloists.
Thank
Looking
you.
forward
Thank
to
you
it.
very much, everyone.